U.S. officialdom and both state and corporate media in the U.S. have described the Ethiopian conflict that began in November 2020 as the Ethiopian government's persecution of the Tigrayan people, particularly in what they call, quote, Western Tigray, unquote, though it was historically populated and cultivated by Amhara people. This land, encompassing Welkait, Tegede, Tselemt, and Humera, was methodically annexed to the Tigray Region by the U.S.'s longtime ally, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, during their 3 decades in power. On April 7, I attended a press conference at Ethiopia's University of Gondar, where researchers presented their findings about mass graves and underground prisons created to dominate and destroy Amhara people who had lived there prior to the TPLF occupation. 10 days later, on Easter, I spoke to Sheba Tekeste, who joined photographer Jemal Countess to travel through some of the canyons and cliffs where the mass graves and prisons were uncovered. We spoke in the lobby of the Goha Hotel in Addis Ababa while a thunderstorm was underway outside. Sheba, tell us about your trip into Welkait from the University of Gondar with Jemal Countess.
It was way beyond what I expected. I expected to see some of the findings that we'd already seen some TV clips of, with the digging of bones and mass graves and such. But I guess actually walking through the rough terrain and climbing up cliffs and sides of mountains and excruciating process and getting to these places, and then also hearing the stories from the people who were guiding us was overwhelming. Tegede, which was the first location that we went to, where they showed us some of the torture camps and the cliffs at Minminne, where Welkait residents during the time before TPLF actually took power in Addis were taken to be forced to denounce their ethnicity and thrown off cliffs if they did not, and these kind of things. Looking at these places as the stories are being told it was overwhelming. It was very emotional. And what was really, really outrageous to me was that there was multiple places that existed with similar stories, and pretty much anywhere we went, even in the path to the worst of the prison camps, which was called Gehanam, people were pointing to places where there's graves, literally in the entire track through, and I think that was over 80 to 100 kilometers in length of cities or towns, small towns. There was just trails of this story, so it was a lot.
Explain what you mean by giving up their ethnic identity. People were executed or thrown off cliffs, tortured, if they weren't willing to give up their ethnic identity. Can you explain what that means and how they were asked to give it up?
So one of the specific stories that we were told, and this was from several accounts, several people were telling us these similar stories, was that the primary targets for these types of killings and torture were elders, mostly men, teachers, historians, and landowners, and basically those who can tell the cultural history of Welkait and the people and their culture, because the objective was to eliminate their entire identity and to replace it with a new identity and force the people to accept that they are now Tigrayan. It was told to us in that graphic form, like, you are Tigrayan, and if you're not accepting of this, then you get thrown off the side of the cliff and killed. And at first, when they said concentration camps, I expected to see prisons. And what we saw were holes in the ground, which were lined up by stone, which looked like walls to like different cells of a prison, which were really narrow and deep. And the way they described it, there would be ladders thrown down and then people would be brought up. So it was almost like a torture camps where they would try to break you. You would be kept in there and you would be tortured. They would pluck people's nails off. There was descriptions of like these worms that were in this, inside of these caves that would go into your skin. You would be taken out and beat and then put back and then taken out again. And it was more of a breaking process until you would accept the authority of the Azaj, as they call them, which means the translation of which means the authority or the commanders, which was a TPLF at the time.
And then you would be asked to take a Tigrinya name and to speak Tigrinya from then on?
I didn't hear that specifically, but it was if you were speaking in Amharic, or if you said I'm Welkait or I'm Ethiopian. One of the gentlemen, Abba Fatanu Gabriye, who was imprisoned for 11 years in total at different time frames, clearly described that he would be asked to join the liberation of Tigray and the movement, and that he was one with them. And he said, I'm Ethiopian, and why would I do that? What does this have to do with me? And I'm from Welkait, and I'm Amhara. And that was one of the reasons he was imprisoned. And all of this corresponds with the other stories from the gentleman who showed us where he was imprisoned for 1 year and 7 months in Dejana. And he said that they would take people out and take them to the side of the cliffs and threaten them that if they did not accept that they are Tigrayan and to speak in Tigrinya, if they held on to their Amhara ethnic identity or they said anything otherwise, then they would be thrown off. So, for instance, he described 74 people that he knew personally that were in and out of that specific torture hole that he was in for the 1 year and 7 months. And out of the 74 people, 32 made it alive. The remaining 42 died. So my assumption, again, based on the stories we were told, is those who did not say, okay, I accept that I am this, they were thrown off and they were killed and never heard of again.
And how safe was he talking about this now that there's a new administration, and for now the TPLF is gone, but this is a large subject, conceivably inflammatory subject, so how safe was he talking about it?
He was more than eager, and there was people lining up, to speak. They were relieved to finally be able to talk. So there was this bursting need and energy to speak, to finally break their silence, which was very clear to me. They were spelling out their name so I could get it right. So I don't know if that tells you something, but for me it said they wanted this on record.
Do you think there's a way to study and commemorate this and make it part of the national dialogue, perhaps broadly speaking, in which it would serve to move beyond ethnicity towards an Ethiopian identity rather than further exacerbating ethnic conflict?
I think that's a great question. I think that even in speaking to people in Addis about other stories where people, regardless of their ethnic group, when they opposed something, were outright opposing something from TPLF leadership, they were disappeared, they were killed. This whole break the silence theme should be part of this national dialogue. And I think when you start hearing some stories, that other people would come forward, and this would really make a change, because it'll actually show that it wasn't just ethnically charged, it was just extreme authoritarianism of some form, where people were just extremely afraid and kept things to themselves, and there was many, many, many victims of TPLF, and not just Welkait. I think the Welkait story just breaks it open.
What about the issue of whether Welkait and these other areas that the TPLF annexed during their rule and called Western Tigray, what about the possession of this area now? Is there a way to get beyond the issue of whether it belongs to Amhara or whether it belongs to Tigray?
I don't think that, if we're going to be honest, that we could ever say that those areas belong to Tigray. First, I think, in my opinion, the first thing we have to recognize is all of these things that we're talking about are a part of Ethiopia, period. Let's start there. And then when you talk about these borders that were created after 91 as a part of the TPLF's start of power, you have to go into the history of the region and the people, and north and south of the Tegede River is just a well-known thing, historical fact, that the Amharas lived south and the Tigarus lived north. It's just part of record. It's part of our history. And then I also want to say, Amharas and Tigarus are just clans or groups of people who are all part of the same national background for centuries, and that coexisted. And it should, it's troubling that we're at the point, we can't deny it, but we're at the point where we're recognizing regions by ethnic groups. And this is part of what TPLF created, just simply creating regions, and not just ethnically, but by language specifically. It's troubling because that's kind of in the fabric of the way people identify themselves now and recognize regions. But before, there was no such thing as this region and that region. You just, actually specified the town or the city that you were from. And you may be a speaker of this language or that language, but that was never a critical part of anything political. For instance, nobody in the past, to my knowledge, would ever say, I'm from the Amhara region. They would say, I'm from Gondar. And Tigray was just like that. I'm from Tigray. And you speak Tigrayan, but there's other places that you speak Tigrayan as well. And it was never divided in this way until the TPLF.
Would the proposed changes to the Constitution eliminate the ethnic identification of regions, Tigray, Amhara, Oromia, etc.?
It absolutely should. It absolutely should. If it doesn't do that, then what is it for? Like, that's the first objective. They should be the first objective. They want to save lives. That's where they start, is completely revamping this whole language, ethnic-based politics. It should be about people's rights and nativity and what they need to survive, and not about, I speak this language, so I have this land, and whatever the case, because absolutely. I mean, it should, and that should be primary objective.
Okay. Sheba Tekeste, thank you for speaking to Pacifica Radio.
Thank you, Anne. Appreciate it.